Good evening, and this is the second session that actually makes up for the absence I had the other day. I apologize for my absence again. I was not well and couldn't be present at the proper time, but I hope that instead of the conversation that we would have had, I'm able to answer some of your queries, particularly related to the exercise of comparing traditional Japanese ideas with modern Japanese ideas. So I put together a PowerPoint that shows some of these connections, or what I call cultural threads, and I will share it now, and hopefully it will be of some use to you guys. So what I wish to do through this talk is to help you guys understand some of the continuities that have emerged between traditional concepts in Japan and modern architecture in Japan. While these are not necessarily literal concepts of any kind, they show a certain clarity in how certain concepts have remained, and they are the blueprints of a culture in the truest sense of the word, because as cultures change and evolve, it is these continuing ideas that become the most resilient dimension of a culture, in this case, going all the way from religious concepts to spatial ideas to even structural thoughts. So I just want to recount some ideas about Japan, just to refresh your memory of the first lecture we had, and some of the things I did not touch upon. Japan, as many of you know, is a country of enormously rich ecologies. I've typically come to find that for me, they boil down to four beautiful ecologies that have emerged into beautiful architectural ideas. The first one is the mountains. The second is the forests. The third is the ocean. And the fourth is the agricultural fields. All of these have incredible relationships with Japanese architecture. As you know, the mountain, Mount Fujiyama, has been a perpetual backdrop. Mount Hiei has been a perpetual backdrop in Zen monasteries particularly. It is impossible to understand many of these Japanese gardens without the backdrop of mountains. So mountains have played a tremendous role in the architecture of Japan traditionally. Forests, it goes without saying, because the entire wealth of timber architecture came and happened in Japan because of the advent of forests. I mean, the Japanese knew how to build in stone, but the abundance of forests, coupled with the seismic geography that Japan had, promoted an idea where they really mastered the art of designing gigantic buildings in timber. The third ecology is the oceans. And there are beautiful ancient concepts and poems that remind us of how the ancient Japanese thought of themselves as an isolated civilization, particularly because they knew they were surrounded by oceans that cut them off physically from the rest of the world. And this, of course, this slide that you see at the bottom left is the famous Futamigora, a very famous shrine in Japan, which commemorates the ocean. And also, as we know, the ocean eventually translates into the most sublime Zen gardens, the dry gardens, which emulate the ocean through rocks and raked sand. And finally, the agricultural ecology, which is largely related to rice, which has translated into so many architectural thoughts. The first one, of course, goes down to the Ise Shrine, where there are many rituals related to the agricultural cycles, even at the Shikinen Sengo of the Ise Shrine today. And then the notion of tatami mats, the notion of washi paper, all have relationships to the fields and the softness and the lightness of the husk and the hay that eventually translates into monochromatic interiors that we find and associate so much with traditional Japan. But there is also another side to this culture which deals with the tumultuous geography of tsunamis and typhoons. And this is one of the most interesting aspects of Japan that has influenced its architecture, the seismic geography and the sort of fragility of the ecology on which Japan sits has created an architecture that is very unique in two ways. The first is that, as I've explained to you in the previous lecture, the structural systems that made many traditional Japanese temples were not fixed hard on their foundations, but they were made in what we call hinge joints, which allowed the structure to move in case of an earthquake. And the second most important one is the idea that transience or impermanence has been part of an architectural consciousness in traditional Japan, whereby buildings in cities would be recurrently destroyed due to typhoons, etc., but they would be rebuilt. And the idea of just rebuilding places, which is not very prevalent in the Western world where architecture was made of stone, is actually a very unique characteristic of traditional Japanese architecture. The earliest dwellings of traditional Japan looked like this. This is in the Jomon and Yayoi eras. They were called pit dwellings. So you would actually dig a pit in the ground and you would cover it with thick thatch. So thatch has been always a very important rustic element in ancient Japanese architecture that remained over the years. You can see in the Yayoi era, for the first time, the granaries, the storehouses where they stored grains, get lifted off the ground. And this is, of course, a practical reason because you want to keep the grains away from moisture, and therefore it becomes very important to let the air float around the entire building. And as a result, the entire building gets raised on a series of columns, which begins to mark a watershed moment in Japanese architecture, because the whole idea of raising buildings off the ground begins right here to enable timber to reduce its contact with the ground and thereby prevent natural rot. And you can see that as houses evolve, the thatched roof remains, but now the buildings are lifted off the ground and they begin to take a architectural form that now begins to start as a vernacular tradition, but over the ages begins to become sublime and formalized into something as beautiful as what we now know as the Ise Shrine. So while the primordial form of the Ise Shrine comes from the indigenous traditions of Japan, it is refined in its character, but the structural system and the idea of lifting the building off the ground with a huge roof made of thatch remains consistent. Ise, as you know, is one of the only Shinto shrines today that is rebuilt every 20 years. 20 years follows an agrarian cycle. There was a time when all Shinto shrines in Japan were rebuilt, but because of the paucity of wood and the lack of availability of timber, now different shrines rebuild only certain aspects of their shrines. But Ise is the only one that actually rebuilds all the 60 structures in two complexes, Ise Geku and Ise Naiku. Another very important building that has had a tremendous influence on contemporary architecture in Japan is the Shoso Inn. This is again a granary building at the Todaiji complex, and it is again a long wooden building raised above the ground by a series of wooden columns. But what is even more beautiful about it is made of logs of wood that are triangular in section. You can see in the corner these triangular logs connecting each other. And what happens is in summer, the logs expand and they create gaps between them because the wood expands, letting the air go through and keep the inside cool and moist. And in the winter, they contract. And as a result, the interior is kept warm and not allowed to freeze because it becomes an airtight natural sealant. So there are very beautiful ways the Japanese carpenters knew how to master the qualities of wood. You can see it's a very beautiful building, particularly the interlocking of the ends and the ladder that takes you to the main door. The entire building actually raised above the ground. You can see the triangular section of the logs right there. And that is the interlock I've been talking about. So at the end of the buildings, this interlock is what keeps this building functioning. The point, architecturally speaking, which relates to what we're going to talk about in terms of modern architecture, is that here is an example where pure structure, what is structure in a building, is exposed on the outside completely. It is not hidden. It is not plastered. It is clearly revealed to you. The entire structural system of the building, the entire raw color, texture of the material that makes the building, the body of the building, is actually revealed very clearly. And these are ideas that modern Japanese architects, as they were beginning to embrace modern architecture from the West, began to observe and began to appreciate with a renewed, refreshed rigor that began to inform some of the buildings that they were creating. Another example of this where raw structure is actually exposed and shown very clearly in the building is the bracket system of Japan, which, as I've explained in my previous lecture, came to Japan from China. You can see very clearly here what the bracket is able to do. While the structural column is actually deep in the building right there, because of the bracket, the roof is now cantilevered far outside the column, which gives the appearance of a floating roof, which allows the building to not only span tremendous spans, but also create the appearance of something floating. Of course, what this also does architecturally is it makes the underside of the roof extremely important, because when you're standing under the building and you look up, you don't see the top of the roof, you see the underside of the roof. So the elaborate patterning of the rafters that hold the roof become even more important than the roof themselves. So unlike Chinese architecture, from where this derives its idea, the roof of the traditional Chinese building is much more curved. One of the differences that happens in Japan is the curve becomes less pronounced and more subtle. And this makes Japanese architecture unique in terms of the identity and signature that it produces. The idea of structural strength and structural visibility as a concept can also be seen in the pagoda of Horyuji. This is a section of the pagoda of Horyuji, which you see right here. And you can see that there is a hinge joint at the bottom. There is a single tree trunk that is taken all the way up. And every member is cantilevered from there to make sure that during an earthquake, you are not supporting the structure on multiple columns, but one single column. And finally, the other aesthetic and structural issue that modern architects do not fail to notice is the idea that on a very strong stone base, the castles of Japanese architecture, traditional Japanese architecture, in this case the Himeji castle, is also made of wood, but in this case the wood is completely concealed in white plaster to give it protection from fires. A contrast that becomes very important for modern Japanese architects in the 1950s and 60s is that while they are very much taken by the structural strength of many of the traditional Japanese buildings that I just showed you, they also realize that there is another side of Japanese architecture which is very eclectic. This is the Nikko, the Toshogu Shrine in Nikko, which is very ornamental, designed by the Fujiwara lords. And again, I often refer to it as the Baroque and the Rococo of Japan. So there are contrasting attitudes to Japanese architecture, as we have discussed in the previous lecture. Now, modern architects, many of them, are not aware of all this, but some of them are. One of the foreign architects who comes to Japan in the 1940s is Frank Lloyd Wright, famous American architect. And he designs a very important building called the Tokyo Imperial Hotel. There is a famous episode where he's sitting with his client in a restaurant, and the client asks him, "Mr. Frank Lloyd Wright, I wanted to ask you how you would solve the problem of having so many earthquakes in Japan. How will you design a building for us, a modern building, that will withstand an earthquake?" And Frank Lloyd Wright says, it's very simple, he says. If you look at the waiter who's coming with the dish, do you see how that waiter is holding the tray in one hand and not two hands? The reason he's holding it in one hand is because he knows that if I trip him and if he's falling, he has a better chance of holding the tray intact in one hand than if he was holding it in two hands. If he was holding it in two hands, it's guaranteed to fall on the ground. What Frank Lloyd Wright is saying is when you have a column that is hinged, like Horyuji, and everything is coming out of it, there's a much greater chance of surviving than if it is a series of columns holding beams. And that is exactly what Frank Lloyd Wright did in this building. So he creates a building that is very modern in the sense that it does have some influences in the way the tiled roofs gently show themselves, and the composition sort of reminds you very remotely of some kind of a symmetry that goes back to the castles of the palaces of Japan. But by and large, this is a very Frank Lloyd Wright building from the 1940s, designed in concrete and brick. But what is beautiful about it is the structure of this is actually made up of two massive columns. And around these two structural columns, everything else is cantilevered from it. And as a result, this building was one of the very few buildings that withstood the major earthquake that happened a few years after it was built. Of course, today the Imperial Hotel is no longer there. It was dismantled. And this is a remnant, a replica of it that exists in one of the museum settings I think it's the Ueno Park. I think that's where it exists in Tokyo. But this is one of the major modern buildings in Japan that actually continues the thread of structure. It is not a visual thread, but it's a conceptual thread where the structural integrity of Japanese traditional architecture, where everything is cantilevered from one or two main structural members, becomes a very important concept that marks the beginning of an important modern epoch in Japan. By the 1950s, with Japan having opened its doors to Western architects, a lot of interesting amalgamation happens. Beginning with the 1920s, 30s, 40s, Western architecture begins to get merged with elements of Japanese architecture. And one of the great buildings of this period is the Museum of Ueno Park, the National Museum at Ueno Park. This is one of the buildings where you can see, first of all, clearly a Western site planning concept, which comes from the City Beautiful movement, a major axis that terminates into a beautiful building. I mean, there is really nothing Japanese about this garden. It is symmetrical, almost like a Renaissance garden with a palace at the end. But when you look at the building itself, you can begin to see a lot of elements of Japanese architecture, particularly the roof, that is now consciously amalgamated by modern architects, or I should say pre-modern architects, onto Japan. So in this case, it is essentially a Western building, but by adding visual elements, such as the dominant visuality of the curved roofs, you are now trying to root a contemporary modernism to the traditions of Japan. So the thread in this case is the roof element, that is one of the most dominating elements of any Japanese traditional building, is now taken as a visual element and planted in what is essentially a modern Western building. The garden, of course, I don't have to tell you, is a very significant element in traditional Japanese architecture. We have talked about this in our previous lecture, but I will repeat some important concepts here. This is the Ginkakuji, the silver pavilion right here. This is a view from the pavilion looking outside into the garden. Again, you can see the dominance of the roof and the garden that surrounds it. You can also see the dry garden in front, a natural scenery behind, and a very rustic building through which you see the changing seasonal colors of the Japanese natural seasons. And the second typology that we talked about in our previous lecture as well is the Zen gardens, which are essentially dry gardens or moss gardens. They are always enclosed. They have a wall that encloses them. They have either a bed of moss with sand and some azalea shrubs, or they have islands with emulations of ocean waves and water that are raked by the Zen monks every day. So these are prototypes of Japanese architecture, and the kind of minimalism that you see here begins to impress modern architects a lot in the 1930s and 40s. And they also begin to discover that while in stark contrast to this, there is another kind of garden, which is the tea garden, the garden of the tea ceremony, where you walk through a forest-like setting, completely created from scratch. You go into a hut, which is a very rustic building. And once you're inside the hut, before you enter it, you wash your hands in a ritualistic fashion at the Chigai-dana, which is the basin. And finally, as you go inside, the sublime ritual, meditation ritual that originated in the Zen monastery to keep young monks alive, the act of making tea and giving it to a guest, becomes a very beautiful, sublime ritual where every act becomes a meditation. And over time, this ritual called the Chan-no-yo goes from the Zen monastery into the secular side of Japan, where it now, through the auspices of Zen masters like Sen no Rikyu and others, begins to become classified into a number of schools that teach this art as both a kind of an art form, but also as a form of meditation at the same time. So today, the tea ceremony is very much a part of Japan. It is a very beautiful ritual that continues a very traditional medieval pattern of Japan that originates in the monasteries, but now becomes a very refined art that enters the household. The other appreciation of nature in Japan is through the seasons that we have talked about in our previous lecture. Japan is a land where the seasonal colors are vivid and stark. So architecture is always seen against this contrasting colors. And one of the things that many scholars have wondered and written about is, could it be that one of the reasons Japanese buildings were very rustic is because they were really trying to create a contrast, a visual contrast with the perpetual natural colors that surrounded them. There was no reason for a building to be extremely colorful. They were largely monochromatic. They were either completely red, contrasting against the green that surrounded them, or completely rustic brown in terms of wood. So it's a very interesting way of understanding architecture, that you always see the building, whether it is monochromatic or rustic, against the natural backdrop within which it sits. You never see the building in isolation, which is a very important concept that many architects today forget. So another important thread that remains throughout the medieval and modern times in Japan is, of course, the Buddhist connection. Buddhism remains a dominant force in Japan today as well. And here is a beautiful temple recently created by one of Japan's most well-known modern architects, Tadao Ando. This is a Buddha temple that he creates, where the open to sky statue of the Buddha is now surrounded by a conical form that is open to the sky. The head of the Buddha emerges just out of that hole, looking toward that oculus, and the entire temple is essentially a mound, which is a very fascinating echo of the early mounds or stupas of original Buddhist concepts that were actually how Buddhist temples started in India. So it's a very interesting piece of work where the mound is now a gigantic garden planted with lavender plants going in concentric circles, and right in the middle is the gigantic Buddha. And when you go into the temple, you look up to the sky, and the lavender creates a fragrance around the temple, which of course is equally sublime. So let's take a break here. And when we return to the second part, we'll continue this talk about how traditional concepts continue today in modern architecture. Thank you.